So things are not looking too bright over in Gaza. In fact, a top UN official has warned an Israeli assault on Gaza's Rafah city could lead to a slaughter. We're joined by Professor Mason Richey this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So, top UN official Martin Griffiths' comment that Israeli assault on Rafah could lead to a slaughter. This is an unusually strongly worded remark from the UN, isn't it?
Yes, it is. This isn't the type of language that we're used to hearing, but it's also an extremely dramatic situation in Gaza. I think what this tells us is a number of things about the war situation there. The first of which is that Hamas has maneuvered Gazans and itself as a fighting organization into a tragic, catastrophic situation. We should, of course, recall that all of this in Gaza, at least in terms of the immediate situation, extracting, of course, from the larger historical context, comes as a result of the October 7 Hamas massacre of over 1,000 Israelis with no regard to international law. However, of course, just because Hamas violated the laws of war and continues to do so by holding civilian hostages doesn't mean that Israel has the right to violate the laws of war either. And of course, there are disturbing reports that Israel has not upheld international humanitarian law in its offensive in Gaza. And of course, it's imperative in the war going forward that Israel does so if and when it carries out this invasion of Rafah. I would also point out, I think, that strategically Israel has pushed Hamas, along with Gazan civilians, ever further south in Gaza. And now the trick is to evacuate civilians north again in order to minimize civilian casualties in a Rafah invasion. This is, of course, going to be very difficult, however, as there's more than 1 million of them in Rafah, which is something like 5 or 6 times the normal population there. Diplomatically, the invasion of Rafah has been in the cards for a while, but Egypt and the West have been working to try to delay or halt this invasion. The West fears a massacre, as we just heard, and Egypt fears a border crisis. And I guess the last thing I'd say is the fact that there are remaining hostages complicates Israel's planning enormously.
Definitely. Now, The Economist reported it believes that Israel's attacks on Rafah really depend on domestic political situations as well as other factors. Professor Richey, what's your take on this?
Well, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argues that, and his government in part argues that a successful Rafah invasion would present a decisive change or a decisive turning point in the war, is it would possibly let Israel finally eliminate Yahya Sinwar, who's the Hamas leader in Gaza, which is a stated goal of Israel, of course. It would, in principle, or at least in theory, allow Israel to rout a number of Gaza battalions and therefore dramatically weaken Hamas. And cut off Hamas critically from supplies of munitions that come across the Rafah border crossing from the south. This would, of course, domestically help an embattled Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as certain members of his government. But of course, there are risks of this type of invasion, both domestically in terms of whether or not it fails, but also in terms of international reputation.
Right. Professor Richey, you mentioned this earlier. The situation in Rafah is worse than ever, with an estimated 1.5 million people crammed into such a small city. How realistic, what's realistic solutions or can there be to allow those residents to breathe?
There are no good solutions there, at least none that are realistic. The absolute bare minimum is an evacuation of civilians, which the Israeli Defense Force says that they're confident that they can carry out, but I'm not convinced, as I think a lot of other people are as well. And among other questions, of course, the big one is where? Where are they going to go? Mm-hmm. They've already been driven south to Rafah from north and central Gaza. Many of them have relatively recently arrived in Rafah from Khan Yunis. So one option would be, of course, to re-evacuate them back to Khan Yunis, but it's bombed out. So there's not a lot of possibility for appropriate humanitarian conditions there. Another option is central Gaza, but Israel has a relatively tenuous hold on that recently, so that doesn't seem like a great option. And then going back into northern Gaza could, in principle, be an option, but Israel doesn't seem to want that, in part because it's trying to work out some concepts there for governance going forward, and this would complicate it by having a large, chaotic influx of people. There are no good options there. It's an absolute disaster in all ways for the civilian population of Gaza.
Right, especially with the UN pledging not to help any forced evacuation. Things are really complicated at the moment. Now, before I let you go, Professor Richey, aren't ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas still ongoing, though? How is it looking this time?
Well, so far as we can tell, it doesn't seem like there is a lot of overlap between the position of Hamas and the position of Israel. But of course, we should never say never. The United States is obviously pushing along with its partners in the Middle East, including Egypt and Saudi Arabia, to try to find solutions for a ceasefire. Hamas has so far rejected those types of offers that it's seen so far, and Israel has also rejected what it's seen on the table so far. So those diplomatic negotiations are ongoing, but they're extremely tricky because of the lack of overlap between the Israeli and the Hamas position, mixed with the fact that these are extremely complicated negotiations, and ultimately, as we sometimes say in diplomacy, nothing is settled until everything is settled. And because this is such a complicated situation, it's hard to get all of the details worked out. And any one detail that goes wrong could unravel an entire deal.
Right. All right. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insight today. Professor Richey, you have a great day.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate it. You too.